I've always hoped for this day. I always wanted to introduce a person who needs no introduction. And here he is. What's your name?
Fred.
Fred. Fred Gardaphe is an old friend of ours. I remember when he was a student and I was at the UIC, and he worked. Did you do any interviews for us?
I didn't do it. I came when you had just finished the interviews.
Okay. Fred has had stellar success in Italian American Studies, and his appointment as distinguished professor of Italian American Studies is something that was unheard of maybe 20 years ago, but certainly 50 years ago when Rudolph Vicoli began the American Italian Historical Association and began the kind of the academic study of Italian American history and culture. It was, no one could believe that we'd ever have a distinguished professor. And we have a number of other professors around the country. There might be, if you add them all up, a dozen or so different programs. And I'm proud to say that along with Tony Fornelli and a lot of other people in this room, we raised enough money to establish an endowed professorship at Loyola in Italian American Studies. And though we're going through some difficult times now, it is an established endowed professorship, and it will continue no matter what you might hear in terms of rumors, etc. We are changing personnel, and we're going to move on, and this will, as every endowed professorship, this will last forever, or at least until I kick off.
No, it's forever.
Oh, it's forever.
The money's there for.
Okay. Well, you probably know more about Fred than he wants you to know, and I know enough that he's always been friendly, receptive, professional, and someone to rely on. He is unselfish, and he is entrepreneurial, and he is a good scholar, and he's one of ours. Fred Gardaphe.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming. First, my family. We're going to have a little cousins party after this, and we took time from there preparing for that to come out. My friends from the neighborhood from years ago, and my Unico friends. I just came from their national convention, where I was, last year I was made the national chair of Heritage and Culture, which really wasn't much on the map. They were mostly, Unico was giving money to a lot of really good charities and research and all that. But Heritage and Culture was something last year. Ralph Contini asked me if I would take on the national chair. I said, well, what do I have? He says, you have nothing. We have no money, but we need your ideas. So people like Richard Caifato were on my committee, and together we came up with a lot of ideas. I put together a program, and I'm happy to say that that program is now going to be funded in some ways by a very generous donation to Unico by Brian Guarco, who's going to be president of Unico in 2 years. He gave $250,000 for Heritage and Culture. And so I'm very happy to announce that and to be a part of this. I want to tell you a little bit about this building you're in. You may know it as the Italian Cultural Center, but without this building, I wouldn't be in this room. My sister wouldn't be in this room. My Auntie Lori probably wouldn't be in this room. This building was built by Father Perini when he got the idea of creating a Scalabrini seminary. And the story that connects my family to this is that, there's two stories. There's a good story and there's the bad story, depending on which one you want to believe. Let's start with the bad story first. The bad story was my grandfather was at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and Father Perini caught him trying to break into the poor box to steal money. And he said, Mike, what's wrong? He says, my wife died, my kids are in the orphanage, I got no job. He goes, Mike, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. And so he gave my grandfather a job he was in the union. He was a hod carrier. I don't know if you know what a hod carrier is. A hod carrier is the guy who carries the shelf of the, what's that stuff, the mortar, up the ladder to the guy who lays the bricks. That's what a hod carrier is. So that's the one story. The other story that we heard also, and I think depending on how much wine my grandfather had, he told one or the other. The other story was that he was in Our Lady of Mount Carmel praying to the Madonna, and he had a quarter, and it was his last quarter, and he puts it in, and just as he's about to put it in, Father Perini says, what are you doing, Mike? He goes, I'm giving all my money to the Madonna because I got no more hopes. I'm going to give all my prayers to her. And he says, what's the problem? He says, oh, my wife died. My kids are in the Our Lady of Angels orphanage. No, what was it? Our Lady of Angels, yeah. And I don't know what to do. He goes, Mike, I'll get you a job. And so the mortar here is courtesy of my grandfather's lifting, probably with a lot of other people who did that. Now, there's another side of my family, the Gardaphe, which a lot of people don't pay attention to because it sounds French. It's actually French Basque. But my grandpa Gardaphe, married Isabella Fusaro, who's from Basilicata, Lucania. And if you go to the newer part of the building, the newer buildings over there, where actually that's where the seminarians slept, I think, right? Over there. You'll see the name Gardaphe there. And my grandmother was a big supporter of the Scalabrini sisters. She talked my grandfather into giving money for whenever they needed it, and she was a big supporter. So both sides of my family are connected to this property in ways. And when the seminarians used to play football, Father Cozy would call us from Melrose to come and play against them. We would play football out in the back field here. So and then my grandfather taught me how to walk on my knees going up the Calvary. Kathy, you remember going up there? Maybe you're a little too young. He made us follow. So the story that I'm writing, I've been writing all my life. All the academic work that Dominic talks about, that got me to be who I am today, but underneath all that is the person you're going to hear today, and the person you're going to hear for the rest of my life, because I'm done. I just finished an academic book. It just came back with readers' reports that want some changes, but it'll be out in a year. It's called What Do You Mean I'm Funny? Humor and Irony in Italian-American Culture. It's probably the last academic book I'm going to write. But now that that's done, I'm working on the stories that I grew up with, the stories that led me to want to be a writer, the stories that I really didn't have the guts to try to make a living writing. And I probably was right, in a sense, because when you tell your own life story, very few are the people who can make a living off their writing. And I never wanted to make a living off my writing. I just wanted to be a writer. So this is a book that I've been working on for many, many years. It's called A Generation Removed. There's a very famous poet by the name of Lawrence Ferlinghetti. When he asked me, I interviewed him back in 40 years ago or more. And he said, what are you working on? He interviewed me. He said, what are you working on? I said, I'm working on a book, A Generation Removed. He said, oh, that's a terrible title. Sounds like a sociological study. And it really kind of set me back a little bit. But he through his life, he encouraged me to continue working on my writing, as did my cousin Rose, who you met Lawrence, didn't you? Yeah. Yeah, she knew all those people. In fact, I tried to be a writer in New York. Rose was living there, and she invited me to come and stay. I stayed in the summer in the Bowery, back in the Bowery district. And I said, Rose, after about a month, I said, too many writers in New York. I got to go back to Chicago. So this book, A Generation Removed, tells the story of my grandpa Rotollo. And another thing I'm working on, I was just telling Ron and Nessie, we're finishing a one-man show, which hopefully will be ready in about 6 months to a year at the most, called Those Who Know. We had a saying in my neighborhood, those who know don't talk, those who talk don't know. And so the title of my play is Those Who Know. And hopefully that'll be a one-man show. That's the Gardaphe side, the part with the violence and the pawn shops and all that stuff. This part is the part that kind of, once our family went through all that violence, and that, I don't know if all of you know the stories, but my father, my grandfather, my godfather all died violently. And once we got through that, it was the Rotollo side that kind of brought us in and nurtured us. And that's why today I can proudly say that I am a property owner in the hometown where my grandparents were born. I'm the first of the family to go back in 1978, and last year I bought an apartment there, and hopefully next year, if you're in Castellana Grotte, you can come and visit it. It'll be ready. So this is a couple of chapters from that book. My grandparents poured into me all the Italy they couldn't fit into their children. To others, they spoke broken English. But to me, the firstborn grandchild, they often spoke Italian. So I became the one who could understand them. As they neared retirement, I was placed in their care on those rare occasions when my parents weren't around. I was their assistant who ran errands and extended their reach. My life became an internship into the ways they thought, the ways they felt, and the ways they got things done. Their ways of doing and being were always explained more through stories than detailed instructions. Now, Grandpa Rotollo was an immigrant who had never really arrived, one who carried the burlap sack of his past wherever he went, a weight that slowed him down in the fast-moving modern America of television and astronauts. Whatever Italy was to me in my youth came from him. He reflected a dual image of my Italian heritage, one of pride and one of embarrassment, images that constantly fought one another. His broken English often upset me, especially when he would speak like this to me when I was with my non-Italian American friends, the ones he called Marigans. His Italian, that strange tongue he would use when spurred to a highly emotional point in an argument, while reminiscing with old friends or when he didn't want kids to understand what he was saying, always enchanted me. His language was the only one way he conflicted with the America I was growing up in. At breakfast, he'd be hunched over a ceramic bowl filled with chunks of stale bread, the kind Mrs. Rossi used to throw out to the birds in her backyard. I watched in disbelief as he poured hot coffee over the bread and then added scalded milk and sugar to the mixture. Then he ate it. While he ate, I gathered the courage to spill my cornflakes into a blue Tupperware bowl and eat the American breakfast I had known from television. He offered me a taste of his concoction, which I rudely refused to his amusement. When I looked into that smile he gave me, I lost the image I had had of him when I first saw him pour that coffee over the old bread. In that closeness I loved, but still didn't understand the immigrant. Grandpa never used the products I thought were essential to American life. He bragged that he never used shampoo or toothpaste and yet managed to keep a full head of beautiful hair and a mouth free of fillings. He used to be able to pick up chairs with his teeth. I was amazed since by the age of 10 I had been already noticing dandruff and had visited the dentist more than he ever would his whole 70-something years of life. He preferred to grow his own vegetables while I'd be fascinated with the ease of picking unblemished, even-sized tomatoes and other produce neatly wrapped in plastic off of supermarket shelves. And I'd be frustrated by the hours I had to spend with him in his garden, sweating to produce a few tomatoes or peppers, and following him through fields of forest preserves, picking dandelion greens and poking puffballs down from trees. Grandma was always the center of attention during the preparation of Sunday afternoon meals. She ruled the kitchen and hollered out orders that separated the house. Sometimes you got to prepare before you give a reading. And I thought I had all my pages. My grandson had put them in order, but Michelangelo, what did you do to me? I think he did this on purpose. All right, so we got Grandma in the kitchen, and she ran the roost with the women in our family, but my attention always turned to Grandpa while we ate. He fascinated me, using bread and fingers to gather sauce that slid off the spaghetti, tonguing neck bones until they were meatless and dry, He could make me forget that I had food in front of me, and he was a noisy eater. But the sounds he made were hardly noticeable amid the loud talk of the others at the table. He rationed the salad of bitter dandelion greens by dancing around the table. He'd put some in each of your bowl, and then he'd keep the whole big bowl with one arm and shove forkfuls of greens into his mouth. When the storm of the meal had blown over, he would sit back and smoke an unfiltered cigarette, often with the lit end in his mouth. We used to think that was magic. He put the lit end in his mouth. Grandpa never learned to read or write, and I would feel so important when he asked me to read something for him. I was the American he could never be. I was proof that his hopes of making it in America had been fulfilled. He never told me why he had left Italy and rarely talked of his childhood. I guess he thought it was enough to be in America and that all that had come before no longer made any difference in his new home. After he died, our Sunday dinners were never the same. With him were buried many of the Italian traditions our family had followed at his lead. Without his influence, Italians quickly became strangers in a collage of media images: spicy meatball eaters, Godfather gangsters, and operatic buffoons. But he did leave me with one curiosity of what the old country was like. One day, the year before he died, he and I were on a beach in Southern California. Our family had traveled to my Uncle Pat's house after my father's funeral. Grandpa sat on the sand. He said, "This beach, she like Monopoly," which is a coastal town near Castellana Grotte in southeastern Italy where he was born. "One day I'm going to go back to Castellana." He said nothing else the rest of the day. He was silent for hours as though in a trance. It was a look I had never seen before, and it frightened me. I covered him with sand, and he sat there until the tide washed it away. He was burned quite badly, but it didn't seem to bother him. He had been in Italy during those hours, and it had been more than 50 years since he'd seen the land he'd come from. Whenever I pictured Grandpa after he died, it was with that sad smile he had on his face that day at the beach. As I turned my energies toward pursuing an education and the pleasures of being a teenager, the memories of Grandpa weakened. I often lost my family and my growing disenchantment with the American way. In the late 70s, I decided to get as far as possible from them. I planned a trip to Europe to visit friends in Denmark and Sweden. As I gathered addresses, I thought it might be interesting to stop in Italy for a few days, if I had the time. Grandma Rotollo had maintained only Christmas card contact with the other family in Castellana. She had the address of Grandpa's brother, and I wrote him. But by the time I left, I had not received a response and wondered if I should even bother to stop there. Now we go to it's alternating chapters between me and my grandfather. This is called The Last Day. Pasquale Rotollo thought his family had too many daughters. Angelina was their first, then Lucia. Anna dreamed of sending their daughters to study with the nuns, but Pasquale laughed and told her that they would have to work in the field until she gave him some sons. When Francesco was followed by Michele, he thought he was on a roll, but then came Antonietta. Michelangelo followed, but then Rosa, and finally Leano. Pasquale thought that once Michelangelo was old enough to work, he could risk sending Michele, his older brother, to America. So in 1912, Michele went off to the USA, and it seemed the investment was paying good dividends. And if it hadn't been for the war, the $4 a month that Michele had been sending home would have continued. Now, Pasquale had fought with the red-bearded Garibaldi, and there was no way he would keep his son from serving the country that he had helped to create, even if the very government he had fought for now was taxing him back into poverty. And so Michele returned from the U.S. only because the Italian government threatened to block future returns of those immigrants of military age who had failed to serve. After his service, he would help the family with one more harvest. Michele's last day, my grandfather's name was Michele, by the way. Michele's last day in Castellana started in silence. He walked to the hearth, where the coffee pot hung steaming above a small fire, and brought the pot to the wooden table where a brown ceramic bowl sat stuffed with stale bread. He poured the coffee over the bread, ate, and thought of work. Michele dipped his fingers into the hot coffee and pulled out a drenched piece of bread. He swallowed it without chewing. When he had done the same with the other pieces, he blew on the coffee and emptied it in one draught. His mother, Anna, cracked brown eggs and mixed them into a large mound of flour. She wasn't singing today. She said nothing. Unlike the other days when she would say something about the fine eggs the chicken had given to the family or announce the new additions to the rabbit family, today she worked in silence. Michele left her in that silence to join his brothers and father in the field. Those fields and the small stone town had been all he had known since he was almost 18 years old. As far as he could see, the fields stretched out, leading in one direction to the hills where the olive tree stood, and in another to the sea. America had taught him differently. For 2 years, he had worked as a hod carrier, building streets and homes in Chicago. Today was his last day of working at home with his father and brother. No one talked today as they bent over picking the endless rows of fava beans. Michele kept checking the sun's position. At lunch, they ate without sharing a word, then napped in the shade of the olive trees. When it sank to the tops of the trees, he loaded the donkey with sacks of beans and headed home. Usually they would all return home together when the sun had sunk below the tree branches, but today he left early to ready himself for the journey. He unloaded the donkey, brushed it down, and walked into the house. His sisters were all in the kitchen, helping his mother prepare for dinner. They all worked in silence. He leapt up the stairs and his eyes scoured the room for anything that his mother might have missed. He sat on the floor and untied his work boots. He changed into his only suit and stepped into his only pair of shoes. He stared down at those old work boots, scarred and scraped so that the leather was as thin as an olive leaf. They would be useless in America. He grabbed them and hurried down the stairs. He had one more thing to do. With his work boots in his left hand and his shotgun in his right, he ran out of the door. His brother, Michelangelo, was outside throwing stones at the wild rabbits that had gotten into his mother's garden through the short stone wall that separated the house from the fields. Maybe he's going hunting, Michelangelo thought. But why does he carry his boots tied together? He doesn't hunt in his suit. Michele trampled over the bean plants, kicking pebbles and unpicked plants into clouds of dust. His eyes were fixed on one tree, the largest tree in the grove near the top of the hill. He slowed as he neared it and stopped at its base. Pasquale and his sons were still working on the other side of the hill. Mario could hear their feet shuffling through the rows of beans, and Michele stood there. What's he going to do, thought Michelangelo. Michelangelo hid behind an olive tree and watched. Michele was a silhouette against the peach-colored evening sky. He dropped the shotgun, grabbed the boots, and swung his arm up, the boots dangling overhead. He twirled around once and let them fly towards the branches. The laces wrapped around a gnarled branch and looked like an old man's arm. He turned from the tree, seeing but ignoring his little brother. The tattered boots hung from the limbs, swinging in the Scirocco's breeze like some strange overripened fruit that had been ignored during the harvest. Michele walked a few steps from the tree, stopped, turned, stared, and raised his shotgun and aimed. He imagined Michelangelo imagined some invisible man hanging from that tree, clicking his heels and toes together as the boots moved back and forth, dancing in his dying. He had once seen a man who had been hung for stealing from Don Pasquale, the face contorted, quickly turning the color of red wine as it twitched and twisted, the pink tongue thickening and whitening with foam as it bulged out of an open mouth that sucked but didn't swallow air. Blam! Michelangelo jumped from behind the tree to see this dying thief disappear, leaving behind 2 empty boots, blown open at the toes, tongues limply lapping the holes. Michele threw the still smoking shotgun at the tree, yelling, "There, it is finished. I am done with this work, done with this gun." He turned and, waving his arms wildly above his head, he ran toward his little brother, who was laughing nervously. His fathers and brothers had run to the top of the hill. When they reached the crest, they saw the boots swinging in the trees and burst into laughter. Michelangelo ran away in fear, yelling, "Mama, Mama, Michele shot his shoes. In the tree, did you hear it? Michele killed his shoes." Michele laughed insanely as he chased his brother to the house. Having killed the silence of the day, he was ready to return to l'America. Chapter 3. It's called Arrivo. It's back to my story now. My trip began in Northern Europe, and the closer I came to Italy, the more emotional I became. In Denmark and Sweden, I had made new friends whose command of English made me feel as though I had never left home. But after 2 weeks, I was ready to parlare italiano. I was in Venice. It was in Venice that I first used my Italian. When the clerk at the cheap hotel asked me what language I was speaking, I was lost. Italiano, I replied. And somewhere here is page 9, which, wait till I get a hold of my grandson. He shook his head. Would you prefer to speak English, sir? I had come to Italy because I thought I was Italian, and that's what I was going to speak. But when that failed, I realized I was more American than I thought. On the train from Venice to Bari, I began to feel confused. I asked myself over and over, what if my family doesn't recognize me? They have no pictures. What if they can't understand me? I've only studied Italian for 3 months, and Venice had proven I could understand it, but not speak it well. I got off the train in Bari to see palm trees. It was really surprising for me to see. I didn't imagine palm trees. Grandpa never mentioned them in any of his stories, so I wondered if I was in the right place. I found a phone booth but couldn't figure out how to use it. An hour passed before I figured out what a gettoni were and where to buy them. You had to buy coins that went into the phone. You just couldn't put coins in the phone. I dropped the slotted metal disc and dialed. Pronto was the response. Ready? Ready for what? I'd never heard anyone use that word on the phone. All I could say was, Sono Federico, arrivo. It took a while to learn that I was still a ways from Castellana. I needed one more train ride to get there. And the reason they use the word pronto is it's ready for transmission. And they still use it today, even though they don't have those old phones. From Bari to Castellana, I stood in the train staring out the window at the vineyards and the olive groves. The scene brought a tarantella in mind, one that Grandpa used to sing while he worked in the garden. I thought of the words and translated them as best as I could remember. In Italy, man and nature live together. The young grape shaded by the old vines, protected from the hot and windy weather, until they ripen into vintage wines. In Italy, man and nature live as one. The old olive tree always bears new fruits. Though whipped by the wind and burned by the sun, man and nature here in Italy like a heel to a boot. Now those words had pictures and that made them mean something to me. Now I understood what he was talking about when he would work for hours in his garden, talking and singing to the plants, telling me the stories, introducing me to each one as if they were neighbors. I leaked tears and realized I had carried my grandfather back to Castellano. The station was empty. I looked up to the sign to be sure I had gotten off at the right stop. Castellana Grotte. Then I caught sight of an old man in baggy brown pants and a navy blue t-shirt that hung over his waist. He looks lost, I thought, as I headed towards the exit. I walked by that old man, shady, squinted eyes. He dropped his hands as I moved into the shade. I turned and looked into his face. Excuse me, sir, I am Federico. And before I could finish, the old man looked into my eyes and flung his arms up into the air. He grinned and his wrinkled face glowed as tears spilled. He kissed me on both cheeks, and then that's when I saw my grandfather in it. He's just like Grandpa, I said, only shorter. His silver hair was cut close to his scalp. His face was thinner than Grandpa's and much whiter, like Grandpa's ghost. The old man was my grandfather's youngest brother, Michelangelo. He led me on the narrow streets and people stopped to watch us pass. I returned their stares and nervous grins and nods. This was a different Italy than Rome or Venice, more like the stark, sunbleak pictures I had seen of Mexico or India, where barefooted children ran through the streets, than any image put into my mind by Grandpa's stories. The sun reflected strongly off the white buildings, darkening my glasses. When I reached the corner where Zio Michelangelo had stopped, I followed the old man's finger to a sign that hung over the store. Salumeria Rotollo. I smiled and followed him through the strings of beads that hung in the doorway. Ecco l'americano, here's the American. The inside of the store looked like a negative of a photograph until my glasses adjusted to the darkened room. Zia Anna stood behind the counter, slicing prosciutto. She had left the knife in mid-slice, looked long at the American with the beard and the backpack, rubbed her hands into her white apron, shuffled around the corner. Anna was a wide woman, as wide as her father. She hugged me and her tears landed on my lips. She shook me, backed away, took another long look, then embraced me again, kissing both my cheeks. She stepped back and her mother hobbled towards me. The old woman's face rippled in wrinkles and she bobbed and cried. I had to bend down to kiss her and I had no idea who she was. People who had been walking by came into the store and soon the whole place was filled with yelling and crying in an Italian I had never studied. As the first of the American family to return to Castellana Grotte, I was welcomed with tears, kisses, and strong embraces. I was a traveler who had come home. I'm going to beat my grandson up. How did that happen? I think he did this. I was the prodigal son who returned home after a long voyage. All the words I had heard about the family now became flesh. I had never seen these people in my life, yet they were all familiar. I felt I had gone back in time. When I had a chance to start speaking, everyone in the store laughed. Listen to l'Americano, he speaks the old Castellanese. Papa, take him to the piazza where he will be understood. So I dropped my backpack. Zio led me back into the street in Piazza Garibaldi to show me off to his friends. Back to Grandpa. Geneva, Illinois was a long way from the city, and there was much work for men with strong arms and tough backs out where the Chicago suburbs were growing. Here, where the air had yet to be spoiled by factory smoke, Michele Rotollo was surrounded by paisans like himself who still depended on their versions of Italian to speak their mind. The old-timers had a saying, Il contadino ha le scarpe rozze e il cervello fino. The peasant may have rough shoes, but he's got a sharp mind. And this was true for Michele Rotollo. His brain had been shaped and sharpened over the years he worked the land of Castellana. He could read signs on and in the earth that others would miss. He could read the skies, and he could even smell the weather forecast. Michele could read anything nature wrote, but nothing written by humans. Back in Italy, he had no need to read words, but all that changed in his new country. When a letter came to Don Dimitrio's boarding house, he had to track someone down to read it to him and write a response. Dimitrio gave Michele a break on his boarding fee for the work he did in the huge garden that helped feed the 10 men he led to work each day. Michele was finishing up the fall harvest one Sunday when Dimitrio's nephew Vincenzo came running from the house, calling to him, Hey Goomba, Goomba! Michele shook his head and readied his hoe. He caught a white flag flapping in Vincenzo's hand. Paulina stood behind the hanging laundry and watched as Jimmy, Vincenzo's new American name, jumped into the garden, landing right on Michele's hole, breaking it in two. Michele threw the broken handle down and grabbed Jimmy by his suspenders. What's wrong with Lou? Look what you do. You tell him what you did. I'm going to pay for this foolishness. Jimmy ignored him and waved the envelope in front of Michele's face. Mike, it's for you. Maybe there's some news from Castellana. Michele snatched the letter from Vince and stared at it. Paulina moved closer. Michele stuffed it into his pocket. Open it, open it. What do you wait for? Yelled Jimmy. I'll read it later. Now I finish my work, he said, turning away from Jimmy. Michele bowed his head. Jimmy recalled the time Michele had received his notice to report from military. Oh, my friend, give it to me. I'll read it for you. Michele grabbed the pieces of the hoe and walked away. Jimmy danced around it and grabbed the letter from his pocket. Michele turned quickly, anger reddening his face. Via, via, leave me alone. Then he noticed that Paulina was watching from a crack in the drying sheets and calmed down. That's okay, you read to me. Jimmy opened the letter and began. 19th of September, 1920. Dearest son, I am answering your dear letter that we were expecting with so much pleasure. We rejoice in hearing that you had a good trip and you immediately found work. We hope you are well and successful. We were also happy that you wrote to us with your own hands, and so you always will. Vince stopped reading and looked up to Michele. Hey, Mike, what is this? You can write, but no read? Vito wrote that first letter for me. I promised I would go to school in America and learn to write them in Italian. I told my mother it was a school in the church. But who has time for such things? Keep reading. Dear son, let me know about those papers you had when you left the military. If you have them still, you can receive a sum of money from the government. I have forgotten how much it is. We can put the money toward the land and it will be good for you. I sent you jasmine seeds in this letter, and for fear of them not reaching you, I also put some in Vito Nicoli's letter. Your father wants you to plant the seeds when the time is right. It will bring you the smell of our land so that you will never forget us. Vito tells us that you work harder than anyone else and that soon you will be making $30 a week. I am told that is more than your fathers and brothers make in a month. What a wonderful land that America must be. We hope that you can soon send us more money so we can continue to pay for the land. So we, by the grace of God, are well, as we always hope for you. Receive the greetings of your brothers and sisters and all your friends. Give our greetings to Vito and his family. Your brother Michelangelo has taken your place in the fields. He is young, but with you gone, everyone must work, even little Michelangelo. Your father says to pay Don Demetrio on time. He is no man to be in debt to. Finn stopped. So she doesn't trust my uncle, eh? No, he just wants to make sure I'm never in anyone's debt, Michele said. There's nothing, just an old man's worry. Go on. God bless you and Mother Mary watch you. We wait patiently for your response. We are your dear parents, Latore Anna, Rotollo, Pasquale. Finito, punctuated Jimmy. Michele took the letter from Jimmy and moved his eyes over the writing until he reached his mother's signature. He kissed it, folded the letter, placed it into his shirt pocket, and the jasmine seeds in his coat. He would find a nice place to plant these later. With Jimmy's help, Michele returned each letter. The quickness of his replies made his family happy. His mother would wave the letters in the air as she carried them home from the post office. The whole family would gather around the kitchen table and listen to her neighbor read them aloud. His letters contained increasingly larger amounts of money. When she brought those postal orders to the bank, she was treated with respect. She had risked sending a son to America, and money came back in his place. That, to those in Castellana, was success. The pain of breaking up the family would be soothed, some with each payment for the land. But all this would change the winter of 1923, which was proved to be a real test of Michele's strength. And the final chapter, little section I'm going to read from you today is called Dialect Man. There I was, in the town where my mother's parents were born. The only thing I was familiar with were the faces of my relatives. Zia Anna, the firstborn, with the same name as my mother and her beautiful face, and her parents, Teresa and Michelangelo, who could have been any of the old immigrants back in Melrose. They were the only ones who understood what I thought was Italian, but what had turned out to be Castellanese dialect from 1920, and a whole bunch of Italian English neither Italians nor Americans could figure out. Zio Michelangelo led me out of the Solumeria, packed with the pre-lunch shoppers, and we headed to Piazza Garibaldi. Why? I would soon find out. Just a few blocks from their home, the piazza was set in the very epicenter of Castellana Grotte, edged in smooth stone sidewalks separated from the main area by thick trees that seemed planted in the same stone that made up the surface of the streets. Michelangelo led me to some large stone monument engraved with the names of those who had fought in the various wars. There must have been a dozen Rotollos listed there. Michelangelo had known them all and started telling me a story about each one. From there, he took me to a tiny kiosk that sold lottery tickets and newspapers. He introduced me to the clerk, Francesco, who it turns out was the town's chief information officer. Soon the whole town would know more about me than I had ever told my family. Zio then brought me to the first bench and began introductions in thick Castellanese dialect that included enough different words to throw me off more often than not. We worked our way around the piazza until he made sure that I was introduced to every old man in sight. This is Michele's grandson, his oldest. He is the first to come back to Castellana from America. I went up to each man, shook hands, and then came back to stand next to Zio. The men, all pensioners, wore the same clothes, baggy pants, white short-sleeve shirts, and cloth sports jackets or vests, all in dull shades of gray and brown. Most had unshaven cheeks, mouths full of sturdy teeth yellowed by tobacco, and noses betraying their levels of wine consumption. Does he speak Italian? I do, I replied. Then began a rapid-fire introduction in dialect about what I was doing there and how long I would be there. Every one of the men laughed when I spoke, and I didn't know why. I assumed it because they thought it was funny for an American to be here. After many conversations, little of which I could catch, we moved across the piazza, down into the basement of a nearby building, and learned was their locale, a cantina, where they came together to make and drink their own wine. We took seats on wooden benches around an old wooden table with a few baskets of taralli, dried dough shaped like pretzel rings. The worker of the day brought out a big jug that he had filled up from a spigot in the stone wall. The wine was thick and dark. Michelangelo held a glass up to the light in the window to show me that it blocked the light. Vino Nero, he called out, the best wine in Castellana, the best in the world. You know that the best wine never escapes Italy. One of his friends called out a toast to the Marigan, and we all sipped away. Another man raised his glass and told us, Vino puro cazzo duro. This brought the chorus to laughter. That means pure wine, strong penis. Whenever my glass was half empty, someone would fill it up again and call for me, Federico, say something, anything. I would begin perfectly, and before I could finish my sentence, they all howled in laughter. I was beginning to feel uncomfortable, even after a glass or two, when I turned to Zio. He put down his glass, pulled my cheeks between his thumbs and fingers, and shook my head. The man to my right, who hadn't said a word the whole time, turned to me and smiled. In the middle of his stubble face was a big nose just a few shades lighter than the wine. He put down his glass after a big sip, reached his hands to take my cheeks between his thumbs and forefingers. His thick fingers were hard and rougher than the stones at our feet. He squeezed me as though he was juicing lemons. His fingers were pliers on my burning face, and my eyes watered from this. He smiled with tobacco yellow teeth and breathed into my face. You are so young to speak so old. The others chimed in. Can you believe this? He speaks the words we used when we were his age. It's like his grandpa Michele returned home younger than all of us. They prodded me on. Federico, say, let's leave again. Chamonix. Tell me it's a cold. Fetch a fretch. Fetch a fritch. I must have had a good 6 glasses of wine before my vocabulary was exhausted. Zio grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. Ora mangiamo. The men protested my departure, and only after another glass and an assurance that I would return would they let us leave. When we got back to the house, I was left at the kitchen table with my cousin Giovanna, a 4-year-old curly-haired cutie who wanted to learn English, so we made a game of it. She would point to something and tell me the word in dialect, and I would say it in English. Teach me more dialect, and I would teach her English, and we used our Italian to navigate between the two worlds while the adults prepared for pranzo. That's the first 4 chapters of the book. From there, the book goes on into all these different things. There's a story of my grandfather driving for the first time he drove a car once. And then another chapter of me driving in Italy, and I stole my uncle's car while they were napping, and I filled it up with gas. And when he woke up, he went out later. He says, he comes running back in the house. Who destroyed my car? He says, my car is drunk. Ubriaco, la macchina ubriaca, he said. My car is drunk. It never had that much gas in it at one time. They never fill it up because gas is so expensive in Italy. They put like 5 euros in, and it's like a quarter of a tank. And they drive for 3 days, 5, who knows how long. So that's my story of driving in Italy. My grandfather's story of driving. My grandfather, a friend had given him a car to use, and he said, I'm not going to drive in the streets. Melrose got these great alleys. So he drove in the alley, and it was behind the alley where Jimmy Spaghetti's was on Lake Street, the alley behind there. And so he drove back there, and he lost control, and crashed into Jimmy Spaghetti's back porch where the family was having spaghetti dinner. Hit the porch, all the spaghetti went flying. Grandpa Rotollo gets out of the car, kisses the ground, makes a sign of the cross, says, "I'm never driving again." He left the car there, and that was the end of his story. But it's these alternating stories. And my Auntie Laurie's here. There's a story of him doing the toast at your wedding and dancing the tarantella, which I have a picture of on my phone, and me dancing in Italy. So it's alternating chapters because I wouldn't have been there without him, but in many ways I was able to bring him back. And now that I bought a house, I'm not going to live there my whole life. I probably will only spend a few weeks a year there at the beginning. But to me, just to be able to say I own a piece of that makes this book a lot easier to write and makes it mean a lot more to me. So that's it.